Why did Hitler lose the war? A response to Dhorpatan's video. Dhorpatan, some historical problems with your assessment lie with the following points. Point 1. Hitler didn't know what he was doing, and meddled with military command. This is true towards the end of the war, but Hitler became influential because he proved the military command wrong both in the Sudetenland crisis, where they expected a war to start, and in the fall of France, where Hitler implemented Manstein's wildly successful strategy over vehement protests from army command. Point 2. Hitler's decision to conquer Stalingrad over Moscow is widely regarded today as the correct decision among military historians. Hitler's view of war was modern in the sense that he sought to deprive the Russians of the resources required to wage war. Stalingrad was the southern port through which oil supplies reached the rest of Russia, and if captured, would severely hamper Russian ability to use tanks, and thus condemn them to defensive warfare. Hitler did not insist on Stalingrad because it bore Stalin's name, but rather because it was the key linchpin to Russia's ability to launch offensives. You are correct in stating that his failure to allow Paulus to withdraw was one of his biggest mistakes. However, his paranoid distrust of army generals was warranted. The army contained a lot of elements who were not sympathetic to the Nazi cause, and there were repeated attempts either at assassinations and coups which became public after the war. The first coup attempt was supposed to occur during the Sudeten crisis, where General Beck would have arrested Hitler and made peace with the Allies had the Czech invasion caused a war. However, since the French and British gave in to Hitler's demands, this made Hitler popular and decreased opposition to his aggressive plans. It is worth noting that even close confidants like General Halder and Spy Chief Canaris disliked Hitler so much that they leaked his war plans to the Allies, who didn't believe them. Hitler knew he could not trust the military class because very few of them wanted anything more than to undo the Versailles Treaty and nothing more. Point 3. Hitler's anti-Semitic policy failed to generate nuclear weapons. I agree with this. Hitler's racist ideology was at the core of his actions and is one of the contributing factors to his losing the war. Point 4. Hitler chose the wrong partners in Italy and Japan. This is hindsight and fails to account for several important issues. While Hitler initially wanted to make peace with Britain, based on racist reasons, he eventually saw that he could not depend on democracies like France and Britain to do his bidding, and aligned with the only other major power left in Europe, which was Italy. They were both similar, because they were authoritarian, and shared expansionist goals, with Italy wanting to expand into Africa and the Mediterranean. By bringing Italy on board, Hitler ensured that Germany was the dominant power and could use Italy as a pawn in the larger scheme of things, as Mussolini later realized. Similarly, Japan was the only other major military power left which opposed the Soviet Union and democracy in general. Japan also was an authoritarian nation influenced by the military and seeking expansion. The British Empire was decaying and relegated to a weak power in Europe, which was only bailed out by the United States. The only superpowers emerging after the war were the Soviets and the Americans. The French were devastated, and the British became dependent on the United States in policy matters. Point 5. Hitler allowed the British Army to escape at Dunkirk. This is a popular modern misunderstanding. Field Marshal von Rundstedt told Hitler that, if he used his field army to wipe out the British, we would suffer many casualties, and would effectively take out entire divisions, in order to be refit for action. Göring promised Hitler he could destroy the Brits using his air force alone, so Hitler decided to be economical, and save his manpower for the war with Russia and let Göring have at it. Göring of course failed, but no one could have anticipated this at the time, and this was the most reasonable decision, especially since Hitler needed his troops action ready, and could not afford time to have them refit given his impending Russian invasion. There is also the unlikely possibility that Hitler didn't want the Brits destroyed, because he still thought a peace with them was possible. Point 6. Hitler lost the war because he allowed resources to be diverted to killing Jews and others instead of being used in the war effort. While this is true, it ignores that most of the killing occurred after the war was lost and the Russians were pushing the front toward Germany. Similarly, the SS was able to conduct much of its genocide without using significant resources, but rather using them efficiently on a large scale. Point 7. Hitler lost the war because he started the war and thought he could stand up to the democracies in Russia who had greater resources. This is partially correct. However, had Hitler benefited from luck in the same way he benefited from luck in the French and Polish campaign, things might have been different. Similarly, had the Russian winter not been the coldest in a century when he invaded Russia, or had he not delayed the Russian campaign for 6 weeks to conquer the Balkans, or had the British not broken the Enigma code which allowed the Allies to know all German plans, things might have turned out differently. In my opinion, Hitler lost the war because of 8 main reasons. Point 1. He didn't allow any of his generals to execute strategic withdrawals. See Manstein at Kharkov, Paulus at Stalingrad, Model in Courland, which ended up destroying his army. Point 2. Hitler went to war on 2 fronts and didn't resolve the British war before starting war with the Russians. Point 3. He declared war against the US, which gave Roosevelt a free hand to send troops to Europe. Point 4. He failed to use the initial goodwill of Ukrainians and Baltic peoples against the Russians. If he had offered them the promise of independence for joining the fight against Russians instead of starving them to death and using them as slaves, the story might have been different. However, Hitler's racist ideology prevented him from ever considering such an alliance. Point 5. Hitler was held hostage to his ideology, meaning the only way to achieve his aggressive aims of conquering and enslaving Slavic peoples was through force, and could never be achieved by diplomatic means. Point 6. Hitler had a high-risk, gamble mentality. Hitler, knowing he was outmanned, outgunned and out-resourced, still wanted to defeat all his enemies in quick succession, and achieve his gains rapidly instead of consolidating his diplomatic gains from Munich, as well as the non-aggression pact with Stalin, and be content with just gradually increasing his influence over Central and Eastern Europe, while isolating French and British influence. Point 7. Hitler lost the war because he was a rigid, inflexible man who towards the end of the war, possibly due to all the drugs he was taking, was non-responsive in crisis situations. See Rommel's request to use the reserves at Normandy during the critical early hours of invasion, which went unheeded because Hitler was asleep and under medication. Point 8. Lastly, Hitler lost the war because he was overly ambitious. He split his army group south in two in order to conquer Stalingrad and the oil-rich Caucasus instead of keeping them united and being assured of accomplishing one of the two objectives. Ultimately, Hitler's high-risk, high-reward gamble was unlikely from the start, something he even recognized at the start, but Hitler believed he was chosen by fate to accomplish his mission, and he never heeded the limitations of reality. Like most fanatics, be they religious, political, or military, he met his fate once the scales of illusion fell, and reality became apparent, albeit only after causing millions of deaths and innumerable destruction to many peoples.